Hi everyone and welcome back to SSW TV. I'm Adam Stevenson and I'm here today with professional geek and Microsoft employee Nick Hodge. Welcome Nick.
Hi Adam, how are you?
I'm really well. You're going to talk to us today about Azure mobile services. I'm sure that everyone's aware that Azure is Microsoft's cloud offering, but can you give us a bit of an overview of what mobile services are?
So, if we look at Azure, where it started many years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, it started as a platform as a service where you could take your .NET code and run it in the cloud, and we had table storage and all sorts of different storage mechanisms. Then in the last few years, we've added services in the cloud, so doing service bus style work, as well as media services for doing media encoding, and also infrastructure as a service. So you can just basically take any VHD or VM and pop it into the Azure infrastructure as a service, and you get that running in the cloud. You can remote desktop into it, or if it's a Linux kernel or that, you can SSH into it, and off you go. What Azure Mobile Services does is it presents a set of APIs for developers who are building on mobile devices, whether they be the Microsoft Windows Phone platform, Windows 8 platform, or the Android platform, the iOS platform, as well as standard HTML. So HTML that is hosted in a web server or website somewhere, and you can use Azure Mobile Services as your service in the back end to deal with your data notifications and services and other things.
Okay, so they're there to help out with multi-platform mobile development. But so what actual features do they have? Like, that's easy to say, but what are the different services that mobile services are providing that let us target mobile device, like multiple platforms?
So the first thing is a fairly standard storage of data. So what gets presented is a REST endpoint to a table. You can send up a packet of data, and that will get persisted into that table store. Now, what's happening behind the scenes is that piece of JSON is deconstructed into a SQL server sort of query and stored in a SQL Server database that you specify when you create your service. In the table, you specify when you create your service. But as far as the developer is concerned, you're just sending JSON packets, JSON objects to that service, either insert, update, delete, or read, and then they get persisted in the data store. So you can imagine, just normal RESTful JSON packets going into the RESTful service, doing what data does, storing it. Over the top of that, then when you start talking about data, you've got to concern yourself with authentication. So what the other thing that Azure Mobile Services has is the ability to authenticate either via a Microsoft ID, Twitter ID, Facebook ID, or a Google ID. So we have in the back-end service all the mechanics to deal with the authentication to those back-end services. And on the client side, you have the APIs for you in writing languages. We'll get onto that in just a moment, to authenticate the connection before you start doing things to the back-end table data store. From a granular perspective, you can say anyone can do reads, but only authenticated users can do writes to the database, for instance, and only administrators can do deletes, for instance. So you have a fair bit of granularity there.
Excellent.
The other thing are back-end services, are time services. So in Windows we call them scheduled tasks. In Linux it's cron jobs. Essentially it's a little bit of code that runs on the server on a time basis. So you can think of this as a service that, say, goes and queries another back-end service, queries and queries a back-end database somewhere over the net, gets the data, and then pops it into your mobile services database on a periodic basis. And you get to say what that schedule is and how often that works. And also is the ability to instantiate your own endpoints. So you can create if the table storage is fairly simple, it's flat JSON objects going in and being persisted. Sometimes you might want to do a little bit more of a complex or tricky sort of query, or a query that might go to your mobile service, or go out and then go out to another back-end service, or go to a different table storage or something else in Azure, or even to a different service altogether. So you can create just endpoints that you can, again, use via REST to do simple queries into, and you can host them in Azure Mobile Services as well.
Cool. So you're talking there about using JSON and talking to table storage. Is there a story for actually talking back to SQL Azure as well?
Yep. So firstly, when you're working with the simple the thing I mentioned right at the beginning, the simple table store, all of that is back-ended by SQL Azure. So when you create your Azure Mobile Service, you actually it gets pointed to either an existing or a new SQL Azure Mobile Service, and you get 20 megabytes of storage for free. But obviously, you can then increment with SQL Azure as a service to increase the amount of storage you put. So essentially, you point it to a table, and then to a database, and then inside that you have just simple flat tables. So the beauty of that is that you can then run queries with the SQL Server Management tool, or you might have some .NET code running somewhere else that can query, as long as obviously the permissions are set right, to go and query and update, or do something to that data external to the Azure Mobile Service. It is just a straight SQL Azure database.
Awesome.
The use of the Azure table storage for blobs, or for which you'd use for images, or the more complex tables, you can do that with the mobile services with the custom endpoints, and you can. The actual language you use on the back end, believe it or not, is JavaScript. All of Azure Mobile Services is written in Node.js. So Microsoft is using Node.js in production today in our cloud service. So that JavaScript that is run before you insert or delete things into a table, or that is the scheduled service, or is the custom endpoint that you've got, is JavaScript. And you can do things like include, or you can obviously do things to do queries back out over the net, or you can use it to do custom SQL queries as well. So you could custom write SQL to do a much more complex join operation, or something that is fairly difficult to try and put into some sort of other idiom and get some data back. But you do get to run that code on the back-end service.
Excellent. So there's also the concept of push notifications, isn't there? So for...
Yes, I forgot that. Thank you for reminding me, Adam.
No worries.
I'll have the product marketing team, beating me over the head for getting the push notifications. You're quite right. One of the things with mobile apps is that users are not, because the devices have low memory, have usually high latency, also lower speed connections, is that people don't tend to have an app, like on a desktop, running all the time, opening and constantly polling a service. So with mobile-style apps, in some scenarios, you want your app to notify the users, the registered or known users, that something has changed, or there's new data, or come back into my service. And so with iOS and Android, and with Windows Phone and Windows Mobile, we have the notification. There's notification APIs built into each of those platforms. And also, the vendors in those instances, whether it's Apple, Google, or Microsoft, have their own push notification service. So the idea is that an app registers with the notification service saying, this user on this device in this app wants to be notified. And so that you get this custom endpoint that you can poke messages to in the cloud, and the back-end service goes and deals with the authentication first, but also finding who you are and where you are, and then sending that notification so it appears on whatever device you've got. So there's a fair bit of moving parts if you use APNS, which is the Apple one, or the Windows services, where you've got to bring up your own back-end .NET server, or whatever backend server, custom build a nice signed package of information. Apple, I think, uses JSON. Microsoft uses XML. I'm not quite sure. I think Google does a combination of both. And then you have to send it to the right place. Now, all that sounds fairly complex because it is, but one of the beauties is that Azure Mobile Services has the ability for you to put in your app IDs, I suppose, into mobile services, and then you get a simple, in JavaScript, you can say, send a push notification to all my Android users, and this is the message, and this is how I'd like it formatted. And then Azure Mobile Services deals with the notification behind the scenes and all the moving parts that appear. And on the client side, registering for that is also much easier with simple couple of simple calls.
That's awesome. So it's taking a lot of the work if you're targeting multiple devices that you'd have to do, using all the different APIs, and it's really simplifying and letting you do it all in one place. And
I think the observation that Microsoft would make is that in the mobile world, is that apps tend to need to be brought up quicker. So you need to, I think the Microsoft favourite term of the month is we need to stand up applications faster. So make them, iterate quickly, get them up, get them working. And you don't want to spend a lot of time, dealing with all the scaling issues you might get of horizontal or deep scaling, which is, mobile services does as you'd expect in a cloud-style service. You don't want to think about that. You want to make your app. You want to make your desktop app or your mobile app just get up and get working and be useful to users, and then fast iterate to find out what is the sweet spot so that you can make money out of it. Or if you're doing stuff in a business sense, is just testing stuff out or prototyping stuff out, seeing if users in the field will accept working with apps in a certain way. So with all of that in mind, Azure Mobile Services takes away a lot of the complexity, but architected in a way that doesn't architect yourself into a corner. So, for instance, the data is stored in SQL Azure. It's not like we're putting the data into some sort of bogus, file format that you don't get access to. You can't unlock the data. The servers are RESTful, so you just can point the REST services to something else if you wanted to do that later on down the stage. The authentication mechanisms we use, Google, Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft Live ID are all fairly well known. So it's not like we're again, architecting you into a particular ID. So it's nice and modular, so you can sort of build and plug things in as need be.
Awesome. And it also, Azure Mobile Services also helps me if I'm building multiple mobile clients and I've got a fair bit of business logic that I need to incorporate in each of the different mobile clients. It lets me kind of do back-end as a service, doesn't it? And I can take my business logic out of my clients and put it all in Azure Mobile Services. So it saves me writing the same logic multiple times in multiple clients.
Yes, that is correct, most certainly. Sometimes that business logic is best not on the client. And when you do put it in Azure Mobile Services, either when you're persisting stuff to a table, or more than likely having bringing up your own simple RESTful service, is you write that in JavaScript. So you've got something that is fairly portable. And the good thing about JavaScript is it's fairly readable and fairly translatable into other languages. If you needed to bring that up in .NET or in Java, for instance, in different environments. Going from JavaScript to that is not a great leap of deduction. There's no automated tools to do it, but certainly you can understand and read what's going on. You haven't got some weird custom proprietary back-end programming language that no one's ever heard of, sort of thing. It is JavaScript.
And if I want to do extensions, and if I want to include other people's modules, there's also the ability to use Node packages, isn't there?
Yep, that's most certainly correct. So because we're using Node on the server side, it's just a matter of using the require and the great package management features that Node has had right from pretty well much to the beginning, actually. So, for instance, Microsoft has written an open source SQL Server driver, I suppose is the best way to think of it, where you can query TDS sources, which is SQL Server style sources, including SQL Azure, and we use that ourselves obviously with Azure Mobile Services, but you could use that to tunnel back into through the virtual networking somehow, some way, back into your own data somewhere. So there's that's just a for instance. There's lots of those node packages out there that you have access to.
Awesome. So it sounds like Microsoft's actually taken, I got to Azure Mobile Services because I've always been a Microsoft Stack developer, and so when Azure came out, I jumped on the Microsoft Cloud offering, and now I've ended up at Mobile Services. But are you finding that you're getting a lot of traction from people who are outside the Microsoft ecosystem who are coming to Mobile Services because they're an iOS developer looking for this functionality to also ship Android applications?
So I'm not in a position to name names, but I do have a story to tell, which is Lachlan Hardy, who's a fellow technical evangelist in crime that I work with, went to a conference a few months ago in Melbourne. It was an iOS developers conference. So he rocked up with his MacBook, opened it up, and he was the only person presenting. And remember, Lachlan works for Microsoft. He was the only person presenting Xcode live on stage. Everyone else was using, their keynotes and their PowerPoint decks and all that, prezzies and all that sort of stuff to present their wonderful wares and their experiences. Well, Lachlan, no, he opened up his MacBook, he opened up Xcode, and he compiled and built an iOS application on stage in 15 minutes, live to Azure Mobile Services. No Microsoft Windows stuff or anything like that at all. Yes, I think that there is an applicability for people who are building mobile, even if they never touch another Microsoft thing in their life. If they're just building for iOS and Android, for instance, there is a lot of places for mobile services in that world as well.
Awesome. So, as an Azure developer though, like if I'm usually working with my worker roles and my web roles,
yep.
How does Azure Mobile Services tie into that? Like how can I leverage? Like how can I tie all of this in together to create a really flexible, powerful solution?
Yep. So if you think the concept of worker roles, a worker role is like an Azure. An Azure REST endpoint. So you could have a worker role that's written in .NET that is doing a very, very complex piece of business logic that is getting data from all sorts of different places. And if you expose REST endpoints, you can just basically from Azure Mobile Services call into that and get a response back. It's and if you architect your services the right way about where they appear in the data center, you're going to get very low latency and very high performance. So a worker role, because it's exposed on the web, is exposed on the web, I suppose, you get access to it from Azure Mobile Services. So the way to think of it is Azure Mobile Services presents this interface over the top for rapid standing up of mobile-style applications. In terms of just standard web roles or Azure website sort of stuff, you could build a whole Azure Mobile Services app that is pure HTML written with pure JavaScript doing normal REST-style queries, jQuery queries to a back-end service. Azure Mobile Services also has the ability to support cross-origin. What that means is that the data that a page served from one HTTP endpoint, HTTPS endpoint, can query data from another HTTPS endpoint, as long as the other endpoint it has got that cross-origin the site's listed, and Azure Mobile Services permits that. So you can use Azure Mobile Services as a backend for just simple HTML pages as well, forgetting about mobile devices. And that can be hosted in Azure, or that can be hosted in your business, your web server that you've got exposed to the internet somewhere else. It doesn't, it is the web. It is designed for this maximum flexibility in mind, maximum openness in mind.
Awesome. So one of the challenges I can see is that people coming up against with mobile services is they're going to have, in the wild, they're going to have different versions of iOS applications and Android applications, and Is there a versioning story? Like, how is there any recommendations or best practices of how to handle versioning with?
There is nothing inbuilt into Azure Mobile Services in the current version to deal with versioning automatically. So you can't sort of say, yeah, this is version 1 of our site. Our APIs, and this is version 2 of our APIs. There's no magic button somewhere to do that, although that would be rather cool. There are some good best practices. So Josh Twist, who is the product manager, the owner of Azure Mobile Services, the father of Azure Mobile Services, probably the mother as well, has some good practices in some, and we'll probably I should send them to you so you can add this to your show notes or into the URLs of how to do versioning with Azure Mobile Services, because you're quite right. You might have different versions of the app out there in the field and in the wild. One of the other things that is a little different in the mobile world as compared to the desktop world is that app mobile stores, whether it's the Google Play Store, Apple's iTunes Store, or App Store, and Microsoft stores across its platforms, do good pushing down of later versions of the app much quicker than we have traditionally dealt with in the desktop world, where people are still using IE6 on the desktop. In the mobile world, it's very much more this concept of smaller apps being updated more often, and users come to expect that. But versioning is still important from a back-end service perspective, and there are some best practices that we have outlined.
Okay, awesome. And this is kind of, almost a related, if not a follow-on question, a related question. If I'm building, it's very common today for one person. So I've got an Android device, a couple of iOS devices, Windows devices, and a Windows phone. And I just expect my data, I expect to be able to enter data on one thing and just have it sync to my data, to all my other devices. What's the data synchronization story with mobile services?
It's probably that's just a good general question, full stop. Actually, in that Azure Mobile Services has no local data store, so it does, the data storage is up to the client. So if you're building a web page, that's using the storage that the local storage that the web browser presents, or if you're working on those mobile devices, it's up to you to store it and do local storage in one way, shape, or form. Thankfully, Microsoft supports and has good SQLite support across all the phone and mobile platforms, and they're the same and quite commonly used in iOS and Android. What I actually haven't seen, though, from anyone, and this is quite interesting, is a good synchronization story, data synchronization story, and we might end up, going and solving data synchronization across different devices for the umpteenth time in this industry, from the time that first two computers were first connected, through Lotus Notes, through let's not go down that path. I do have actually seen that the team that wrote the SQL Server data synchronization tool that was around about 6 or 7 years ago from Microsoft have actually started work on that so that it will work on Microsoft devices with different back-end stores, so not just SQL Server Lite or SQL CE, but with with SQL CE or SQL Embedded. We're also working with SQLite, I should say. That was actually published open source about 18 months ago, and I have seen some work on that, but I must admit it's not something I've looked at of late. I'm sorry, Adam.
No, not at all. So that all sounds amazing. It sounds like if I was a mobile, if I was looking to target mobile devices, it's definitely something that I'd spend some time in. What are the gotchas? So if I was going to go and start, can you give me a tip? What's the thing that I'm going to bang my head against? What's the most common feedback that you've had?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. They're good points. The first thing is that if you have come with a bit of a back-end experience, and you know about SQL, you know about third and half node, the normal form, and you've got your nice table layout and you've entity relationship diagrams. It's all nicely described. That is not what SQL. That's where you go and use SQL Azure and you build your own services to that. The data storage is simple flat data storage. You can have multiple tables or lots of flat data, and the idea behind that is to reduce latency or compute, how much processing happens on the back end, and also understanding that the data that you're tending to store with these mobile devices is simpler than a full-on ERP or CRM style system. So you have to architect with that that thinking in mind. That doesn't mean, you can't integrate to those. It's just that the storage that you're going to be doing is going to be relatively simpler than a full-on third normal form SQL or Oracle, SQL Server Oracle sort of database. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you're working in JavaScript. So from a language perspective, JavaScript is interesting. I've got a book just sitting up on my shelf. I will get them. Just excuse me for the listeners here. I'll just grab them just as an illustrative point. So this is a book on JavaScript, the Rhino book, nice and thick. Lots of words, lots of examples, lots of JavaScript is simple, but there's lots and lots of stuff involved in it. So that's the fullness of JavaScript, and that's probably, I think, ECMAScript 1.1. Yeah. Anyway, so it's not the latest, but it's late enough. And this is JavaScript, the good parts. Which is written by Douglas Crockford, who now works at Yahoo and is a very well-known JavaScript person. And this just is a little bit of an illustrative, sort of funny, but JavaScript has a lot of good stuff in it if you use it the right way. And this book I highly recommend if you want to use JavaScript the right way. But bear in mind, JavaScript is a slightly quirky language to work with if you're coming, especially from a .NET. Very formal typed system. Thankfully, Microsoft have some workers, some smart people on that with things like TypeScript and that. TypeScript, which will emit JavaScript, which you can then put in Azure Mobile Services. But just that's probably the other big thing is JavaScript on the back end.
I like to. I had my favourite phrase I came up with by accident. I got stuck for a month writing JavaScript, and I went from being as a C# guy, spending a month writing JavaScript. I started off thinking it was the worst thing ever, and I think it was like JavaScript Stockholm syndrome, because by the end of it I walked out going, "Wow, this language is actually fantastic."
Yeah,
it's one of those things that I think once you get into it, it definitely grows on you. So
and so you've got to.
All of the back-end developers should be getting a bit into. Have a look at Node. It's not just for jQuery.
I agree. It's a beguiling language. It's like a siren song of a language. It's got bits of functional programming in it, a bit of object-oriented programming, a bit of scheme and the Lisp and that sort of history in it, and it is weird oddities in it, but. Like a siren song, it will draw you in, and then you'll probably even make your C#. You make your projects different, even in C# when working with after you've worked with JavaScript.
I'm redoing my blog in Node. Yeah.
Cool.
So so let's say we're sold. We think it's a great idea. What do I do to get started?
So if you're already using Azure, it's another service you see over there in the panel on the left-hand side, Azure Mobile Service. You make a new one. You get up to 10 free Azure Mobile Service sites free of charge, so they're not going to cost you any money. You just say, make a new service, add a table, download the samples, the Visual Studio project if you're on Visual Studio, and off you go. And there's lots and lots of videos, both on Channel 9, mostly on Channel 9, I should say, that are really, really good. The documentation for Azure Mobile Services is excellent and is very well kept up to date as well. Josh Twist, if you do a Google search or Bing search, or do a Google search in Bing or Bing search in Google, Josh Twist, look for his blog. He's got some very good samples of different questions he's had as well, and how they're solved. If you're not an Azure customer, it's very simple. You get I think a 60-day free account. I don't think you even need to put in a credit card anymore, but you get a 60-day free account where you can just try things out and bring things up. The user interface for doing the admin is all web-based, so you can use Safari or Chrome or whatever. You don't have to be on obviously nothing to do with Windows at all if you don't want. We have some good Eclipse plugins for Windows Azure as well. The SDKs are all hosted pretty much on GitHub these days, so you can see what. So rather than just getting an SDK that is opaque to you, you get a nice transparent SDK you can have a look at and poke through and debug through if you wish to. So it's very easy to start with Azure.
Thanks, Nick, for joining us, and thanks, guys, for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends.